If you were to ask someone why North Korea is very poor, a common answer might be because it is a communist country. But this answer is too simple. The real question is, why is North Korea much poorer than countries like China or even Cuba? Why is it in a worse state compared to the Soviet Union or Yugoslavia under Tito? During the mid-20th century, the world was split into two main groups, the capitalist countries and the communist countries. And here's something you might find surprising. North Korea wasn't always this poor. There was a time when it was seen as a successful example of socialism, while South Korea was considered the opposite in the capitalist world. In fact, there was a point when North Korea was doing so well that it sent food aid to South Korea, which seems unbelievable today. Back in the early 1980s, North Korea was producing over 10 million tons of grain every day, but now that number has dropped to less than half. What might be new to you is that up until around 1993, North Korea was doing better than China in terms of GDP per capita. This means, in simple terms, that it was considered a wealthier country. And 1993 isn't that long ago, especially when you think about how different North Korea and China are now in terms of wealth. In the years when North Korea had its good times, the actions taken then shaped what we see now. It was considered a model socialist nation. So why did people once see North Korea as a perfect example for those supporting socialist revolutions? What changed to turn it into what it is now? A country known for its deep and widespread poverty. What are the key reasons behind this severe downturn? In fact, North Korea has faced such a drastic decline that today, even the most dedicated supporters of communism wouldn't praise the economic or social progress of this country, unless they have a liking for the ridiculous. One thing that's not talked about much is that even among communist countries, there were big differences in how wealthy and developed they were. And yes, North Korea was one of the richer and more developed ones. Especially in the 1960s and 1970s and even into the 1980s, people in North Korea were somewhat richer than they are now. But North Korea is just as communist now as it was in the 1980s. So there must be another reason for its severe poverty that has lasted for decades. The Korean War from 1950 to 1953 devastated both North and South Korea, leading to a severe economic and humanitarian crisis. The way each country recovered from the war was seen as a test of whether capitalism or communism was superior. At the time, some people, including intellectuals and academics in the West and even in the USA, weren't sure which system was better. Therefore, the superpowers of that era took supporting their Korean ally very seriously after the war. The USA and its Western friends gave South Korea a lot of financial aid and loans, with little or no interest. Similarly, the Soviet Union and China provided North Korea with about $2 billion from 1950 to 1970, along with essential resources for rebuilding and industrializing the country. To industrialize quickly and outdo its southern neighbor, North Korea used several strategies. These included traditional economic planning seen in communist states and the creation of a social movement to achieve its goals. This approach initially worked well. The five-year plan from 1957 to 1960 solved major food and housing problems and set the stage for mass industrialization and development. From the end of the war in 1953 to 1958, North Korea's industrial growth rate averaged 43% per year. However, the economy that people experienced daily wasn't growing as fast. In 1958, North Korea launched the Kolyma movement, its answer to the Soviet Stakhanovite movement and a rival to China's Great Leap Forward. Unlike the Great Leap Forward, the Kolyma movement is generally seen as somewhat successful. Its main goal was to boost worker productivity without much financial incentive. Instead, ambitious production goals were set, sometimes aiming to double output yearly. The state media highlighted the best workers as almost superhuman heroes. Although industrial and agricultural production didn't double in a year, the movement made a noticeable impact. For example, in 1959, industrial output, especially steel, jumped by 53% compared to the previous year. Workers started putting in 10 to 12 hours a day and also worked on weekends and holidays, driven by a strong sense of patriotism. As a result, in the 1960s and 1970s, North Korea was doing exceptionally well. In the 1970s, it saw annual GDP growth rates over 10%, with some years nearly hitting 25%. Agricultural output tripled in just over a decade. The country received cheap oil from the Soviet Union and industrial technology from East Germany and other Eastern European nations. This support helped North Korea develop industries that were more advanced than those in South Korea or China at the time. Between the early 1970s and 1985, North Korea's nominal GDP per capita rose from $384 to $836. Although North Korea's GDP per capita was still low, it's important to note that it surpassed China's $600 mark a decade before China did in 1995. Pyongyang was rapidly expanding, with new industries around the capital, making it a model socialist city. It boasted broad, clean streets, well-kept gardens, fountains, streetcars, and subways. North Korea was unique in the communist world at the time, and its progress was seen by many as almost miraculous. During this period, North Korea also saw significant improvements in public health, with life expectancy reaching 70 years and infant mortality dropping from about 120 per 1,000 live births to about 30. In the 1980s, Pyongyang even became one of Asia's fashion hubs, influencing China and other socialist countries. Besides the steel industry, North Korea's economy benefited from mining minerals like magnesite, zinc, tungsten, and iron, which were vital for both domestic use and export in exchange for foreign currency, oil, and technology. North Korea at this time held a significant position and influence within the socialist world, with ambitions to extend its influence beyond. In the 70s and 80s, it aimed to become a bridge between communist and non-aligned countries, strengthening ties with nations in Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and even some in Latin America, while supporting revolutionary movements in Africa. Despite North Korea's ideology of juche, which emphasizes self-reliance, its international actions during this period show a more complex reality. The country was actively engaging with the wider world, contradicting the simplistic view of its ideology. North Korea, while not extremely successful, was doing relatively well compared to other countries in the communist world. It was a better place to live within that context, far from what it is today. There was a sense of prosperity, but then things took a turn for the worse. The question is, how did a country that was somewhat prosperous by socialist standards end up facing one of the worst famines in the late 1990s? What mistakes led it to become so impoverished? North Korea's political ideology called juche is deeply influenced by its own version of communism. It was crafted by its leader, Kim Il-sung. Juche emphasizes self-reliance and sovereignty, a mix of doing everything on its own without outside help, all wrapped up in communist ideology. While this sounds good in theory, it's much harder in practice. Despite this emphasis on self-reliance, North Korea was actively trading with other socialist countries, importing and exporting goods. It also borrowed a significant amount of money from communist nations, Western and Japanese banks, engaging with over 100 banks across 17 countries, especially during the 1970s. This funding was used to expand mining operations, construction, and food imports. Mining, in particular, was pushed to increase production to counter falling mineral prices, becoming a crucial source of income for North Korea. However, continually expanding production to keep up with falling prices was not a sustainable strategy. North Korea began to struggle with repaying its loans, leading to its debt being rescheduled in 1977, 1980, and 1984. Eventually, the country defaulted on its loans. By 1987, North Korea had defaulted on loans totaling about $770 million, a significant portion of the $1.65 billion to $2.75 billion it owed to the non-communist world. Much of the remaining debt was owed to Japanese banks, with interest and capital growing, and even after Russia wrote off 90% of its debts, North Korea's foreign debt was estimated to be between $6 billion and $15 billion, according to the International Journal of Korean Unification Studies. One particularly stark example of non-payment is the case of 1,000 Volvo vehicles ordered by North Korea nearly 50 years ago, which were never paid for. The Swedish National Export Credits Guarantee Board estimated the outstanding debt at 2.9 billion Swedish krona, about $267 million, up from the initial 600 million krona purchase agreement. However, suggesting that North Korea's current state is solely due to its unpaid debts is overly simplistic. It's like saying a party is ruined because it ran out of ice. There are many more factors at play. North Korea's inability to adapt its production model to global changes, coupled with fatal mistakes related to a lack of market perspective, insufficient supervision, and oversight of those in power and widespread corruption, have all contributed to its current predicament. Two main reasons explain why North Korea is in such a poor state today. Firstly, in the 1980s, unlike other communist countries, North Korea didn't make significant reforms to its economic and political system. This was a time when its two big influencers, the Soviet Union and China, were starting to open up and reform. This left North Korea isolated from globalization and without foreign investment, causing its competitiveness to fall. While China and the Soviet Union were modernizing and integrating with the world, North Korea was stuck in the past, not updating its industries or economy. The second, and perhaps more crucial reason, is the massive military expansion North Korea undertook from the 1970s and intensified in the 1980s. This push for full military independence meant a huge portion of the country's resources was directed away from civilian needs towards the military. Infrastructure that could have boosted the economy, like roads, ports, and water systems, was neglected. This made the country very vulnerable to natural disasters like droughts and floods, setting the stage for future crises. This focus on militarization became even more pronounced in 1993. With the communist bloc collapsed, North Korea announced plans to withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, despite having ratified it 8 years earlier. This decision further isolated the country internationally and highlighted the extent to which it prioritized military development over economic or social welfare. In 1994, North Korea initially canceled its plans to withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, but ultimately left the agreement in 2003. This decision was in response to the U.S. suspending oil shipments after North Korea disclosed a secret nuclear program. Reactivating its Yongbyon nuclear facilities, North Korea embarked on a determined pursuit of weapons of mass destruction, severely impacting its struggling economy. During the late 1990s, North Korea faced a devastating famine that led to the deaths of between 500,000 and 2 million people, depending on the source. Despite this crisis, the government continued to allocate funds to military development and even hindered international aid efforts by refusing to allow foreign organizations to oversee aid distribution. This action was perceived by many as an attempt to redirect some of the aid towards the military or other non-humanitarian projects. The situation worsened in 2006 when North Korea conducted its first nuclear test, leading to the first set of economic sanctions by the United Nations and additional sanctions by individual countries. Surprisingly, until the first nuclear test in 2006, North Korea's economy was relatively free to import and export goods with minimal restrictions. However, the nuclear test and subsequent sanctions significantly altered this, isolating the country further. The core issue was not just the sanctions, but North Korea's choice to prioritize a large-scale nuclear development program during a famine, disregarding international concerns. Politically, this strategy might have seemed logical to the regime, as it remains in power in 2024. However, from the perspective of the North Korean people and the economy, the decision was disastrous. Following the famine and the collapse of the communist bloc, which also contributed to North Korea's decreased competitiveness, the country has not recovered. Its GDP per capita remains at levels similar to those of the 1960s, representing 6 decades of stagnation. North Korea was once doing better than South Korea and even richer than China. It got lots of support from its communist comrades, had a good industry, and was able to feed its people. But then, it made some terrible choices. North Korea wasn't open to change and rather spent money on the military instead of investing in the lives of its people. When the communist bloc collapsed, North Korea struggled tremendously. Instead of addressing its failing economy, North Korea kept focusing on military spending, further alienating itself from the world. Today, North Korea has a devastated economy, and its people are suffering because of decisions made by its leaders. Whether this situation will change in the future remains an open question. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe to stay updated with our latest content.